talk I'm going to give today is very much related to, in fact, is identical with the teaching that I do at Stanford, and therefore, for you as parents, I'm very interested in you getting a taste then of what it is that I do and why I do what I do. You'll see it says chapter 4, and that's because I teach a big intro course at Stanford every fall, and I do it in lectures, as you might imagine, but each lecture is called a chapter, and I'm really trying to tell a story. And if you look at this word love, you might be confused because you might think, well, I'm a professor of art history, but I really reject that category, and I reject that category as a principle of uh, humanistic teaching, just generally. That is to say, I'm not an expert. I don't believe that my business at Stanford, drawing a paycheck, et cetera, is to do with my expertise, as though my students are simply, people who are acquiring knowledge that they could very well get from Wikipedia from me. That's bullshit. That's not what I do. So as I get older, I'm trying to think about what do I personally have to give, and damn the torpedoes. Like that's it. Every lecture is the last lecture, and the course becomes therefore very philosophical about matters such as love or fear, beauty, pain, sadness, despair, all these things. Every single lecture is about something like with a one-word title, and each is a chapter, and the chapters are the book, and the book is really my students, because as I tell them, the course material, so-called, is really about them, the art that they see in a museum. And this applies to all of us who are adults too. The art we see in a museum is about us in the sense of it's asking us if we care to take up the request that how does this concern us? How can we surrender our superiority and our expertise and a sense of ourselves as defined simply by what we know, who we know, what is our command of other people and of resources and so on, and how can we recognize our mortality and think a little bit more intensively about how precious life is. So, love. I don't mean love like falling in love in a romantic sense. I mean love in the sense of, agape, Agape, like Christian love, like a kind of selfless love. And there's just one picture I want to talk about in this respect. And it's just like all the works of art I teach my students, it's just ones that has gradually impressed itself upon my attention and asked me to really make sense of it. It's just an 8 by 8 inch piece of paper with a drawing on it by this artist named Henry Ossawa Tanner, who was born in 1859, lived to 1937, American artist. And it's a self-portrait, probably. Um, Perhaps in the guise of Lazarus, the person who was raised from the dead. In any case, love. If you and I, if there were going to be an exam at the end of this little presentation, and I said to you, well, you have to rely upon this one piece of paper to try to give your account of what selfless love is in the world, what would you say? And of course, what would I say? So I'll start with the hand on the heart. The hand is centered in the picture and is, I think, like boldly marked out, really carefully, heavily drawn, as though the artist would emphasize this moment in the picture. And you could say, therefore, that love is about some kind of intensive awareness of one's own body. I'm not even sure it's one's self, but it's one's body, the beating of one's heart. We say what in regular everyday life, we say, "Oh, my heart beat quicker," when this and that happened, etc. So that's one thing. But here's another that as much as the hand is delineated so boldly, calling our attention to the heart, the face is kind of washed out. And I don't take this to be a half-finished drawing. I think he really made all the choices and regarded this as finished. And therefore, it's interesting that if this is about love, The eye is really occluded, almost like partly erased, the mouth as well. The whole face has a kind of washed out quality. And what I take from that is that to love in this fashion is selfless, like it's a effacement, of who one is in one's, let's say, one's passport identity, one's driver's license, securitized sense of oneself, right? It's beyond that. Another thing I notice, if you look at, say, this squiggle down here, I'm interested in the way, with everything being quite careful and quite chosen here, it matches on the same axis, the ear. There's a kind of spiritual excitement to this state, quite apart even from the hand on the heart, that any artist worth their salt who's showing a religious theme tends to take full advantage of the drapery or the clothing of the person experiencing the ecstasy, as billowing about as though in a windstorm, and that's a way of suggesting excitement, ecstasy. And so this is no different. This big billowing sleeve here is conveying something of that rustle, let's call it, and then also within the sleeve is this dynamism of marks that just suggests that to experience this kind of selfless love is not only to feel one's heart beating, not only to be effaced or self-effacing, let's say. It's not all about you, it's not all about me, but to experience this rustle of excitement. And here's another thing too. There's a kind of sleight of hand in this picture, which I think we all at a glance just take for granted, but is actually quite peculiar, which is we don't see the bottom half of his body. We kind of recognize that he's sitting at a table, I would say, or some kind of flat surface. Like, see that real horizontal jag of black there in this drawing? So we feel the elbow is resting on a surface, and likewise this hand, but there's no table and there's no lower body, with just the interesting and important exception of this little line here, which almost like the string on a helium balloon just kind of holds him down or tethers him to the bottom and just gives us a sense that he does have a lower half. But here's the implication for us, is that he's rising up. There's a lift. And since this figure, this self-portrait, is supposed to be as Lazarus, he's resurrecting, where he was dead and he's now alive. And there are different ways to understand the parable, the story from the New Testament, but one would be is that Lazarus has simply overcome. He's not so much dead as depressed or in despair, and he's risen up, and love has saved him from despair. However, it is to experience this kind of love is to be lifted up. And here's another thing too. I love the way he's looking up here, and of course, there's nothing there, and naturally, there's no other figure in the picture. Presumably, Jesus is in the vicinity, but we don't see Jesus. But what I take from that is two things. One is um, he's being taken, lifted, and I'm sure you can relate to this, out of his own little world, out of himself. There's a term for this that I think is really valid with this work, which is being sent. Have you ever heard that? You know that love song, "Darling, you send me, you send me." Um, he's being sent, like sent out. And we have this word, very innocent word, adventure. What an adventure. Like, I went to Six Flags, or I did a romp, I did this or that. Adventure has to do with venturing forth to meet one's destiny, or, to encounter chance. It's a knightly, a courtly, a noble kind of pursuit to be in an adventure. Love of this kind is an adventure. It's being sent. You're being sent out of yourself. And by a kindred term or sense, if you look at this part, the picture, he's also receiving back into himself, almost in the sense of having received an arrow or a wound or something like that into his chest there, something that's coming from without. There's a radical way in which to experience this love is to be sent out on an adventure from within one's own heart and to receive back something accordingly. There's something else about this too, which is so interesting, and it has to do with this other hand, which I mentioned briefly. I guess the whole fascination of which is that it hardly satisfies to just call it a hand. It seems less formed than the other hand. Partly, maybe that's just because of the angle at which we see it. But to me, it always looks like a paw, Paw, like a lion's paw. And I'm reminded of a fable someone told me about the reason for the roar of the lion. The reason for the lore or the roar of the lion in legend is that every cub, every lion cub is born stillborn, and it's only when the lion roars that the cub comes to life. So, however legendary that is, it hardly is out of place with the generally legendary, kind of dream of this entire talk. And what I take from that is that love roars us into life. We're stillborn without it. These are all, of course, platitudes, and they've long since been captured, not only for us on this call, but for my students by commerce. And you can be sold all the things I'm telling you for a price depending on your pay scale and all that. The capitalistic capture of all these points is ubiquitous, but that doesn't mean that there isn't in these small moments, works of art sometimes contain them, these moments of grace. But let me say more about this, which is that, the moment, such an experience, the moment is so fragile, like what I'm talking about today is very fragile. It's delicate. It's on just this little piece of paper, 8 by 8 inches. And I can tell you that when I was in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian looking at this drawing, little more than a year ago, um, I became aware there in the special collections of this very loud sound, kind of like a wood shredder. Coming from outside, just outside the building. And I asked my host, the archivist, the librarian there, what the sound was, like a wood chipper basically sound. And she barely batted an eye, and she said, "Oh, that's the CIA. They're doing their document shredding. Every they do it every Tuesday at 11:45, et cetera." And I just became aware of how fragile this moment was, where here I am looking at this 100-plus-year-old piece of paper and really encouraging my students to pay attention to such small things themselves, while outside, all this paper is being mulched. And I went and took a look at the window, and the company, you probably have seen these, like there was this big truck out there, and the company name is Iron Mountain. And the slogan, also painted on the side of the truck, is "Secure destruction you can trust." And I thought that was so interesting, that the secrets are being destroyed there, but a work of art right in front of me in the archive there was and is a secret that is somehow magically preserved. Love is in these manifestations of resurrection is a secret that somehow has survived. And it's fragile by its very nature and its very survival. Another thing about it is if you look at the way this is obviously cut out from some larger sheet, maybe by an X-Acto, it's hard to say, maybe by the artist, maybe by the artist's son who gave his father's materials to the Smithsonian. I don't really know, but it just tells us that these moments are excised from the larger flow of life. They're cut out. But I'm always reminded of something Joseph Conrad, the great novelist, said in this regard. He said um, to rescue a fragment from the flow of time, basically, get this, is only the beginning of the task. Like if you or I found this drawing on the street and gave it to the Smithsonian, that would be wonderful, but it would be only the beginning of the task. And what Conrad goes on to say is that the true business is to hold it up by the light of a sincere mood, without apology, without fear. That's education. Does it happen at Stanford? A lot? I don't think so. I think it's a lot about the news cycle and what's happening tomorrow and different things that are more useful than what I'm teaching my students, but possibly less consequential. Um, you see there's some writing here. I don't know, maybe it's almost impossible to notice or to really see without me guiding you, but that in a way is a point. That would seem to be the caption as in capture, caption as in what's the point? What's the takeaway? What are the learning outcomes of this picture? I think it's important that I just cannot read what it says. It really does look like it was erased. Even in person, I've never been able to decipher what that means, but I think that's to the point here that we're talking about these ineffable categories. And the staining on the picture, I think, is relevant too, because whoever's
Looks like we um, lost audio, or he froze.
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, yeah. I was saying that who among us doesn't regard these moments, however sentimental or embarrassing we may regard them, as among the most important in our lives. So um, we're not perfect. This drawing is stained and kind of defaced in a certain way. I think that's part of its beauty. I do want to say that you see this date, 1910, like Tanner is making this work just at the time when this kind of art is disappearing from the world and this kind of sentiment. If you just invoke the name of Picasso and Cubism, that's coincident. That's at the same time as this. So you can see like this is a kind of last gasp of this kind of art, this kind of belief. And indeed, we've come to create a distance, a kind of ironic, skeptical distance from the idea that art could be about love. We want it to be about information, style, quote unquote meaning, all these different kind of things that are really less interesting and less compelling, less urgent for us in our lives. But in any case, I want to take seriously this idea that this marks a kind of endpoint. Maybe that's part of the fragility of the phenomenon, like love is in the world is always at risk and in danger of being mulched. And I just want to briefly, just by way of autobiography, give you three pictures that when I was my student's age, when I was a student 40 years ago at the University of Vermont, I loved. I didn't know why I loved them, but I knew I loved them. And now, because I have gray hair, I've kind of come to understand exactly why I do. And they all belong to earlier moments in this tradition that Tanner is really like the anchor runner on. So here's one of these paintings that I loved 40 years ago and still love and still teach. And by the way, I teach my students the paintings that I love, not in order for them to subscribe to my taste, but to remind them that they need, whether they study art history or not, most of them don't, they need to make sure they make contact with what they love in works of art and, of course, elsewhere, or else we're living shallowly. So, in this picture, which shows a woman, Irene, coming to tend to Saint Sebastian, the Christian soldier who's been shot and left for dead by his comrades in ancient Rome. They've come at great risk to themselves. It's midnight on the Roman streets. They're tending. She's seeing if he has a pulse. It's not really a meet cute kind of love like a Romeo and Juliet love. It's more of a selfless love. The heart you see, or at least I see, that's very clear in her gown, her red gown, is to do with that kind of caring. And I always loved this painting. And I just have to say, very frankly, like I didn't even have the slightest clue why until fairly recently. And I just saw, and maybe to you it will be so obvious, but I just saw, oh, this is about giving love selflessly. That's what it is. Uh, and maybe that was so moving to me because that's not, at age 20, that was not very self-evident to me in my own life. This painting too, I also love back in my studies. And, I told a colleague at Yale where I used to teach, like, this is one of my favorite paintings at the Louvre, I said. And this painting, like the previous one, is um, is really in the same room at the Louvre. And my colleague, who's a very learned person, said, that he was baffled by my choice of this painting of these two nuns, one of whom is a Mother Superior type, another is a convalescent young woman who actually is the daughter of the painter and is recovering after, and it's described in this Latin inscription on the wall here, an illness of some 14 months that left her doctors despairing of her ever recovering, but she is convalescing. And I was always and remain so moved by this picture. And I think what I've come to understand about it is that this woman, it's so moving to me that she's being cared for, but even more so, it's moving that she is receiving love. She's accepting love. She's not dropping, abjectly on her knees, like thinking she's not saying she's not worthy of love. She's very contentedly receiving love with grace. And here's another picture that also, when I was 20, as you look at just me thinking about what love is with the incredible multi-wick candle that Irene holds in the first picture I showed you, and then the extraordinary dense folds of the woolen uh, habit that Suzanne du Champagne wears in the other one. Like, love is this dynamic stillness, this grave excitement. But here is this other picture, which, um, wow, I wrote on this paper like in 1984. I got an A on my paper. But did I say anything that was really touching, even grazing what I found so moving about it? I don't think so, but I'm not critical of myself. I mean, my Stanford students are often much ahead of me where I was when I was their age. In any case, this painting, the Virgin Mary, is looking pensively over at her son who's just pricked his finger on a crown of thorns he's been making, unlike most pictures of Jesus, who's either shown as a little baby or being crucified. This is a very rare picture in which he's shown as an adolescent. Um, his mother is shedding a tear as she looks at him. I think I really responded as you look at this scene of these two incredibly stable figures, monumentally, triangularly stable, Virgin Mary, and then her son here, mixed in with the strangely off kilter, out of whack, perspectively, walnut table here, and then this blast of golden light with the angels hovering, and then this window here in which you see the sky. You almost expect the Wicked Witch from Wizard of Oz to appear in that window. That it's this incredible combination of stability and craziness, of being grounded and being lifted up in the air, kind of like Dorothy's house in The Wizard of Oz. And without going too much into the autobiography, I would just say, wow, I kind of understood something about my own relationship to my mother in this picture. And the way I formulate it for my students is love is a stillness and a disorder that love itself causes. You know, I I guess we would say like when we're in the sort of force field of love, we experience both the calm and the storm, all of which I've come to understand partly just from talking with my students over the years, being so fortunate to teach such brilliant people. So this picture is then part of that same investigation, not only for me, but for them, receiving love, giving love, being born again in so doing, and the peril of it. I think most of the world runs on this kind of thing. And I don't know what I offer, but it would be, if you look at that slogan there, it would be something like tenuous, tenuous creativity you can doubt, you know, like if I had a truck and I had a business and I went around preserving people's secrets, I suppose that's what it would say. So obviously, I'll never be the next new thing at Stanford or anywhere else because the world doesn't run that way, but it doesn't mean it's not needful of what I provide. I just want to say on that note that what I do at Stanford and what I'm doing right now and how I think generally is this weird blend being of being supported and yet without support. So if you look at the drawing here in Washington, um, in its mat, in its, frame, and there are my nice little notes there and so on. Um, this picture of this man who is seated at a table, but we don't see the table, is nonetheless as itself, as the picture on a table, you can tell. So it's supported, and I'm supported. I have my research money. I can go to Washington, D.C. I can look at the pictures. Stanford supports me in a million ways. I couldn't do my, I couldn't do what I do without that support, and I'm really grateful. But I can offer you no support for anything I'm saying except the fact that I'm saying it. And I guess the adage, the principle here is that it's only what cannot be verified that seems most important for me to articulate for my students. And if that sounds preposterous and, a waste of what is the equivalent of taxpayers' money, like hear me out. I think it's probably not that different what I just said from the platitudes about higher education, that the best teachers are the ones who ask questions and don't provide answers or help help students to think rather than simply to know or something like that. I mean, I suppose it's a version of that. Um, but I think the place of offering of being without support is crucial. And it is a kind of self-portrait, what I do. I don't think I want to deny that. Is the person on the left the artist who you see in a photograph there on the right, Henry Ossawa Tanner? Of course it is, but it's also me in a way. But I think that's an interesting kind of blend of. So here we are. So it is the professor offers a portrait of themselves, but not ideally in vanity, but in order to be what we call real or vulnerable, in order to model the idea of connecting, I guess, with works of art in the way that I advise or wish for my students to have themselves. Um, is such a picture, you see a detail of it here now, is it to do with my students themselves? Is this what I wish for them? Whatever work of art they may be moved by, whatever work they may love in this selfless way that allows them to experience the selflessness of themselves, is that really what this is picturing? I think it is in a way. So all of this is to say that uh, one can, do a lot with a little piece of paper that's 8 by 8 inches. I think the challenge for you and me on this call, but also for my students, is how do we not take things like this as just more stuff that's cool or uncool, and instead dig in and kind of recognize the earnestness of ourselves and the seriousness of our calling as as people at Stanford, but also as people in the world, and that there is no time uh, not to think that intensely. And this is what my role is as a teacher. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Nemerov. I think that was fascinating. I mean, I'm sure that, at least speaking for myself, I would never have seen all those details in those paintings. Let me start with a comment from Krista Nichols. She says, Professor Nemerov, I understand why my daughter Bridget loved your classes. They're sermonic, loving, nurturing. Thank you for sharing the same with us as parents. We really appreciate. I think the whole purpose of the Distinguished Speaker Series is for us as parents to get a sense of what our students are experiencing at Stanford. So thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you.
question for you. I subscribe to the belief that art, music, poetry, literature are important for young people to be perceptive, sensitive, and have empathy in any profession they embark on. So, a lot of Stanford students are in the sciences, and how do they get to make a choice like attending one of your classes?
Well, my classes are available for anyone to take. Um, so it's not hard for people to take them. Um, the class from which I've given you a taste of here today, like that's probably the biggest. It is the biggest class I teach at Stanford. I would say it has an enrollment about 100. So the CS classes, the big ones, have what is it, like 700 students. The version of this class, people always ask me about this. The version of this class that I taught at Yale, where I taught from 2001 to 12, had about 600 people in it. So Stanford, I've taught at Stanford now for 13 years, since 2012, and it's pretty much holding steady at 100. It, the things I'm talking about now, I love the question and I love the students I have at Stanford are fantastic. But it's not a thing. It's just not a thing at Stanford. What I teach is not regarded as that necessary to a Stanford education. And that's I think it's, as a teacher with your gray hair, you become you gain some wisdom at least and about teaching, how strange it is. And one of the funny things about it is the better I get as a teacher, the fewer students I have. Yeah, isn't that funny? I mean, maybe we all have an equivalent of that in life, but my class is so much better now than it was at Yale. I'm not being critical of myself, but it's just a fact. We all get better at things the more we do it, and with age, I think I've gotten more perspective. So, but fewer and fewer students take it. So, um, whatever. It's kind of funny in a way.
So I think one of the things you said was that your role as a professor was to make sure that the students are asking the right questions rather than you're providing them answers to. Doesn't that hold true for the sciences as well? And if students were to take your class, would it not help them in their careers, whatever they might be?
I think it would. Yeah, absolutely. I don't really subscribe to the idea that, that there's a partitioning of not of spheres. Like I think some of my best students are computer science majors or I have this student who's a biomedical researcher. She's like 3D printing organs, basically. Unbelievably brilliant young woman. When she comes to office hours, I'm taking way more notes about what she says than what she says, what I say, than she's taking notes about what I say, right? But she switches into art completely, like seamlessly. She can, there's no difference between 3D printing, these printing of organs and her ability to talk about a painting. And that holds true, but in the culture at large, that is the Stanford culture at large, everyone from the undergraduates to the administrators, I think, adheres to this stereotype that the science people do their thing and the arts people do their kind of nutty, inventive stuff that has no real world purpose. So it's really hard. As you all know, in any walk of life, it's very hard to disrupt the cliches about the common sense platitudes about things. But the nice thing is that every year I get to experience students whose intelligence far exceeds our cliches.
Question, context appears to play such a critical aspect of engaging with artworks like exploring the ideas of agape love. Is this also true for contemporary art? Would love to hear your perspective.
Well, it's an interesting word, context. I mean, I gave you almost no context today. Like the only context is what I thought about the picture. So if that's the context, I would say if you walk into a gallery of contemporary art, you are the context. I mean, you and the art together make the context. You might pick up a brochure and learn some things, and that might be helpful. Yeah, I don't think that's out of bounds at all. But I try to teach my students to, as Emerson would say, have an original relation to the universe and not farm out their own viewpoints to experts or outside opinion. And if part of the question is that contemporary art can be very baffling, the banana taped to the wall or something like that, sure, one can feel more at sea, more alienated from that. So it is maybe a more specialized kind of language where a little context would help. But even then, I I I don't know. I think we can hold our hand on our heart and think a little bit about how we're responding and rely on that as our principal context.
So at Stanford in the administration, which are the offices that promote the arts and humanities?
Oh, there's a whole bunch of them. Yeah, I mean, of hardworking people of deep conviction. Um, the one example is the college program. Maybe some of you have heard about where freshmen now take a 1 year mandatory course on the first quarter of which is about why are we even in college? And it's designed to challenge the unfortunately pervasive assumption on the part of undergraduates and others that Stanford is a pre-professional school, like 99% speaking. And so this question, why college? And so people read ancient authors and they read contemporary authors who are all theorizing about the point of education and more specifically a liberal education, like a wide ranging philosophical education. Like what is the purpose of that in the world? And I've taught two versions of college. There are a bunch of professors and lecturers who teach it every year in small sections of like 15 freshmen a section. And I've done it a couple of times. So there's stuff like that. Um,
Right.
but I don't think it's as simple as administrators mandating that that kind of education be important at Stanford because in my experience, though I've met some unbelievable students in those college seminars, just amazing people were quoting Martin Luther King from memory. These are freshmen in the first week of class. Like Stanford is a special place. Um, I've also met a lot of people who are really rolling their eyes and cannot believe that they have to sit through this crap. So there's strong resistance to the idea of reading a book at Stanford, unfortunately. Too much, there's too much to do, too much real world stuff to do. So that's unfortunate and it's a fact.
So here's an interesting question. If it was possible, what would you ask the artist of the self-portrait?
Um, I certainly wouldn't ask him if I'm quote unquote right about what he's talking about. I think that would be demeaning. I would probably, it's such a great question. I would probably ask him where he was coming from when he made that work. Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Like where he was coming from, not only like the day that day or the day before, but in his whole life.
right. So another comment here by a parent who says her sophomore daughter tells me that your classes have a cult-like following, and the class you're describing is called simply Nemerov by the
Uh,
students. Another question, what has most influenced your understanding of any engagement with art and life perspectives?
um, yeah, well, that's first of all, that's nice about the Nemerov thing. Thank you. Yeah, the students who are into it are really into it. Um, and one of the lovely things about speaking of giving and receiving and the adventure of an education is I feel like now I'm really learning more from my students than vice versa. I feel like I'm able to set up a conversation or a space in which we can all learn from one another, but I get a lot myself. Um, yeah. What can you just, Pradeep, can you just repeat the question? I'm sorry.
What has most influenced your understanding of an engagement with art and life's perspectives?
Paying attention to what really pierces me and affects me, and shaving away the different elements of distance, suspicion, cynicism, irony, detachment, too cool for schoolness in myself, so that I can speak from the heart without apology and fear and hold something up, as Conrad said, in the light of a sincere mood, you know. Um, I was saying this last night at an event in the city that sincerity, it's underrated, and it's very powerful when it comes forth. And so for me to speak from the heart, I think that's what I try to do. And of course, I'm just as failed and fragile as anyone else, so it's never perfect, but I'm trying my best. And I think that's been the key, is to look inside myself.
So here's a parent asking for your thoughts on her daughter deciding between a university in Japan, which she is favoring, and UCST, which is the parent's choice. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know enough of the context. Is that just to do with the location? Is there more to the question?
Is there something about art, how it's taught in Japan that you
Mm,
know of?
I see. I have that I do not know, but art can be taught anywhere in a very disenchanting way, you know. And the disenchantment takes different forms. One is through like just this is what you need to know, very kind of empirical business. And then another is like by making it very I don't know, there's a very angry way to teach that has to do with grievance and dissatisfaction and the news cycle. And so, it's kind of a gauntlet that any student has to run. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't
Uh,
know. I mean, as a parent, like I don't know how
yeah.
I'd want my daughter to go to Japan, all the way to Japan. That makes coming home for Thanksgiving a little tougher. I don't know. But on the other hand, one of my daughters goes to Stanford and the other one goes 2,500 miles away. I I don't know. It goes to my alma mater actually. So I don't know. I don't know. That's not very helpful, but whatever.
So do you have a perspective on engaging in art tourism like Michelangelo's David, for example,
Mm.
versus surprising art discovery, the way you found this very simple drawing compelling to you?
Yeah, it's such a good question. You could perhaps mix them both. You could go to Florence to see Michelangelo's David and then happen to see a poster on the street just outside the museum that really breaks your heart or something like that. I mean, I think the key is to not curate in the simplistic neoliberal sense of that word, uh, one's experiences such that the so-called approved touristic ones are the important ones automatically. And as long as you have your photo op with the David, you're all set. But rather to be copiously alive to what is within and without, that is outside the museum. And I talk a lot with my adult students as well, with the younger ones about epiphanies, and they can happen anywhere. And many of the
Yeah,
ones my students have told me about have nothing to do with art museums. They're more or less
yeah,
the walking down the street, I turn the corner and blank, this happened, and there's a lot lost when we're tourists, obviously.
yeah. So, do you offer classes to parents or continuing education as well, similar to what you're teaching students?
Yes, I do. I teach for Stanford Continuing Studies, and the past two winter quarters, I've taught a version of How to Look at Art and Why, which is the course I've taken from for today, to adults, yes. And then right now, in fact, tonight, I'm doing a lecture for this course on Van Gogh, which is continuing studies. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Uh, so here's another comment. My incoming freshman and I were chatting with Dean Satz earlier this week, and she recommended your class as a must. My
Mm.
perspective m- my prospective major kid is now very excited to take it, and I'm thrilled to have been able to listen in today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.